floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the invite and the opportunity to talk about this stuff. So this is one thread that of a larger project that Evan Westra, my new colleague here at Purdue, have been working on. This sort of center of gravity is norms and norm psychology. So we've got independent projects, and then we're collaborating more and more. What I'll present today is somewhat of a work in progress. So we have a version of this as a public philosophy essay, which is coming out in Eon magazine in a month or two. And then we're also working to turn it into a larger and more academically meticulous and responsible journal paper at some point. So I'm very looking forward to the feedback and any thoughts you have on good ways to develop this as we go. So there's Evan. He would have been here, but he has to teach right now. So everything I say now is in conjunction. I'll use the first person plural a lot, and that's not the royal we. That's actually literally Evan and I. All right, so start off with an example that hopefully resonates or at least sounds familiar to some of you. I don't know how specific this is to my side of the Atlantic, but I get the sense that this is a sort of global thing. So meet who we'll call Jordan. Jordan is, for our purposes here, a professor. He's a philosophy professor. Thinks of himself as being generally liberal and kind of forward-thinking. He doesn't see himself as a radical, but has a long history of being enthusiastic about progressive causes. And he's mostly well-liked by his students, but sort of as he gets older, he finds sort of a gap growing between him and his students, especially on social issues. And in his darker moments, he suspects that the problem here doesn't lie with him. But more on maybe the upcoming generation has been a little bit too coddled as they were children, or everyone got participation trophies, or maybe they've had their minds warped by social media. But there's maybe something a little wrong with the youth these days. He's coming around to the view on. And then the first day of a semester, he does the usual introduction thing. He has his students introduce themselves and state their major, maybe a little bit about them. And one of his students says, "Hi, my name is Alex. My pronouns they, them, and I'm a senior in philosophy and psychology." This isn't the first time that Jordan hears this kind of thing, but it's not common to him yet. And inwardly, he kind of rolls his eyes. He finds this new trend of stating one's pronouns, sort of irritating. Just one more example of what's wrong with today's youth, as it were. He lets that initial one go, but as he's speaking in the seminar, he sort of initially tries to get himself to, maybe a little half-heartedly, maybe initially in good faith, to call Alex by their preferred pronouns. But as he sort of ends up persistently misgendering Alex and referring to them as she. And when Alex corrects him, even if it's not with a lot of malice, he still feels a sort of flash, sort of a little bit of frisson, unpleasantness, maybe even a flash of anger sometimes. And finds himself later when he's surrounded by other older, often male professors, maybe hanging out in the faculty lounge, if that's still a thing. He ends up sort of grumbling about this, and they sort of grouse with him. The student forcing him to use they them pronouns, and a lot of his, you can imagine, a lot of his peers sort of agreeing with him that yeah, we're progressive, but this whole thing with pronouns seems like frivolous, or maybe it's even gone a little too far. So fast forward to the future, and from this initial sort of annoyance or this initial irritation, we find that Jordan, at least when it comes to pronouns, hasn't changed his behavior. In fact, he's sort of dug in and become more entrenched, more opposed to this kind of new custom of announcing what your pronouns are and using non-binary pronouns. He sees it again as symptomatic of this larger cluster of problems. And so he becomes almost increasingly and overtly hostile to those who are, from his point of view, sort of inflicting these changes or these new prescriptions upon him. So it's not just inwardly or sort of behind closed doors that he grumbles now, but increasingly he sort of outwardly rages, or maybe he takes to his Twitter account about the sources of this, what he sees as on the good and the sensible. And of course, in the culture, there's a lot of people willing to take him up on this and sort of encourage his slide into denouncing left-wing authoritarianism and the woke mind virus, or whatever else it's being called these days. So all of this, the sort of trajectory that we've painted, hopefully recognizable, is over what initially started as something which should have been, maybe mildly disruptive, but certainly small. It's trivial almost. An adjustment in the way we address another person. Again, Jordan's story should be maybe familiar, maybe alarmingly familiar, and maybe we can all just relate a little bit to the kind of reaction he has to this, where we have a way of doing things, and something that we see as being common or just routine or sort of ordinary starts to become viewed as wrong, or we start to be told that it's wrong. And our first reaction to that is sort of annoyance. It's irritation, which tends to be paired with kind of a knee-jerk dismissiveness. And examples of this, so we've painted a concrete picture to start, but examples of this in the recent past aren't hard to find. We've sort of been searching around on this. You go back a couple decades, people responding to new regulations that were sort of being imposed in the workplace, having to do with sexual harassment and conduct there. And you find people with these sort of willing to be quoted in the newspaper of record, albeit anonymously. An indignant personnel vice president complained in the New York Times that if sort of these regulations that were attempting to rein in, sexual misconduct were implemented, then men would be afraid to speak to a woman in the office without speaking to a lawyer. We have a nice YouTube video. I won't try and show it here with the tech hurdles, but of people reacting to seatbelt laws, which were being imposed in the 1980s, and just sort of being unable to even consider the very minor change in their behavior it would take, and people talking about, well, I'm going to drive around this town that's implemented these laws because it's infringing on my freedoms. A little bit more recently, something we can all remember was the resistance that a lot of people had, and the kind of annoyance that came with the imposition of masking and social distancing laws, which were put into place for the collective good and for individual safety when the COVID pandemic hit. And these sorts of things are kind of ongoing. So another example we have is, you're eating your lunch and someone starts talking about their veganism, and you just, come on, man, I'm just trying to enjoy my BL over here. Why do you got to get in my face about this? Don't be so self-righteous. Expressions that were used to be normal and are no longer seen as acceptable, and just being asked to do these kinds of things as new norms come into play. Maybe one for all of us academics, being asked to decolonize your syllabus. Might be another example of this sort of thing, which even if you can sort of see where it's coming from, it's a standard response is a kind of annoyance. So at some point, like I said, most of us probably can think of some instance of this kind of thing, where we've had this knee-jerk reaction when we're confronted with change that seems to us frivolous and that we just as soon not have to deal with. And it often has a kind of affective sort of frisson to it, or a kind of there's a feeling associated with it, often annoyance or irritation, something like that. And it if that's our initial reaction to a lot of these things, it can have downstream effects on the way we reason and what we do. If we start off with this sort of initial reaction of dismissiveness and defensiveness. So what we want to slap a name on this. So under scrutiny, it seems like what we're implicitly relying on in these cases, or the kind of logic that's built into the heuristic, along with the feeling of unpleasantness that comes with it. We're going to call it the eye roll heuristic, after our story of Jordan. And the logic seems to be something like news things that seem irritating are unlikely to be genuinely morally significant. And so behind the heuristic, there seems to be this expectation, again, often not voiced explicitly, but an expectation that when we're confronted with kind of genuine moral reasons or sort of actual instances of moral progress, they'll be self-evident, they'll be sort of easy to recognize, and they'll go down sort of smoothly. We'll accept them, we'll rise to the occasion, they'll sort of shine through with their self-evidentness. And so behind this heuristic, if that's the kind of logic which is built into it, the trouble is we know there's good reason to think anyway that this often isn't the case. So as Christina Bicchieri has argued, as Anthony Appia has argued from very different grounds, and many others, moral arguments, sort of pure propositional reasoning and arguments of that sort, on their own seldom lead on their own to major social changes. A lot of times arguments are too easily dismissed, or they're ignored, or they're sort of rationalized away. And even when the arguments seem plausible, it's very easy to persist in immoral behaviors because of social pressure, because of the institutions that we live in, because of the society and the culture that we find ourselves ensconced in. And this is why a lot of researchers have begun seeing change and thinking about ways to guide it in terms not just of reasoning and argumentation, but in terms of social norms, and social norms as being a key variable or point of intervention when it comes to understanding and trying to bring about social progress. And given that that's the case, it's why, on our view, it's vital to develop and continue developing an adequate cognitive science of social norms and the interactions and the psychology that constitute them. So we think that cases like Jordan's, sort of to begin to develop the diagnosis here, reveal something actually very important about the psychology of norms. So what we'll do in this talk is argue that Jordan's eye roll responses, what those are an expression of or what they reflect are a number of affective processes which are built into or work in conjunction with our norm psychology, which ordinarily help us sort of fluently navigate social interactions, move through our worlds with a kind of fluid agency. But the very same aspects of the norm psychology and the emotions that are involved there that help us engage in kind of fluent social agency also respond aversively to norm changes. So on the view we're going to develop, we should expect that most norm changes, even positive ones, even when the old norms are being replaced by better ones, which are more fair, more just in a variety of ways. Just the fact of the change is likely to be experienced or to generate experiences of annoyingness. And if that's right, then the upshot is we can explain some of this friction, this affective friction, which sort of bubbles up to friction on social change, and also the eye roll heuristic, which underlies it as being unreliable and untrustworthy. So just overview of where I'll go from here, talk a little bit about the current state of the art in norm psychology, develop this notion of sort of term of art of affective friction that's at the center of our argument here, say a little bit more about it, so not just necessarily the core of affective friction, but some of the emotional elements that are likely to be in the area of social norms and interactions which involve social norms, sort of consider a couple of objections and say how we'd reply to them, and then have a discussion. Good. So norm psychology, like I said at the beginning, Evan and I have both been doing a lot of work on this. So the term norm psychology, for the purposes of today, we want to use it in some ways to sort of capture something, but which is neutral along a lot of dimensions where there's still very active debate, sort of interesting proposals being made and considered right now. In the neutral aspect, so we'll think about norm psychology, or what we have in mind when I use that term, is that it's a cluster of traits, sort of a set of specialized behavioral and attentional dispositions. These can include cognitive, affective, and motivational processes, different sorts of mental representations that give humans the ability or the capacity to do norms. And then that idea can be unpacked in a number of different ways. Evan and Kristen Andrews have a nice paper that was published last year where they spell out the idea of a normative regularity, which is a group level pattern, which is sustained in a particular kind of way. It's sustained by practices of punishment and reward amongst the members of a group. And so norm psychology are the set of processes and mechanisms which allow individuals to collectively realize these sort of group level patterns. And there's good reason to think, or at least an initial heuristic, a way to think about them in the case of humans anyway, is that this is the psychology which allows us to intuitively grasp the unwritten rules of social life and then navigate them in the appropriate ways. So this characterization, like I said, there's lots of debates about what norm psychology looks like in humans, whether or not we find it in non-human animals, whether or not parts of it are innate. Some people have argued about norm psychology on an analogy with Chomsky's view of linguistics. Other people, especially Celia Hayes, published a really nice paper last year arguing that norm psychology is by and large acquired. She thinks it's one of the kind of cognitive gadgets that she's been defending for the last couple of years. Again, for the purposes of this talk, I don't think we need to take a on anything above and beyond the idea that humans have sort of a piece of their mind which is dedicated, it's functionally specific, and it's dedicated to allowing them to acquire and then act in accordance with whatever the social norms are which prevail in their home environment. So another useful piece of terminology for us here will be that of internalized norms. So of course, humans can know about or cognize all kinds of different rules. I can know about the rules of some ancient society in a purely cognitive way, but you know that those rules, even though I can think about them, they don't govern my behavior and something like the way the norms that I've genuinely internalized have connect up to my motivational resources. So the idea of an internalized norm is just, this is a rule, not just that someone knows about or that they can think about, but which is being handled by their norm psychology. So an internalized norm is one that influences their behavior in sort of characteristic ways, together with their attention. And like I said, it connects up to their motivation in a number of ways. So a norm which has been internalized, or a person who has internalized a particular norm, that allows them to engage in sort of social interactions relevant to the norm, which are fast, which are frugal. Oftentimes, the norm itself will be aimed at allowing them to coordinate with other people, maybe in cooperative endeavors. But their sort of relationship to the norm is that they can comply with it effortlessly and sort of fluently. They can execute in their behavior the norms which it prescribes in ways which are similar to the way they can engage in well-learned habits. So internalized norms and the thought processes and attentional processes and behaviors associated with them have a lot of the characteristics that mark sort of system one thinking, automated cognition, and mental heuristics. Like I said, importantly for an internalized norm, there's a good case that norms which have been internalized are thereby intrinsically motivating. And the intrinsic motivation is sort of two-pronged here. It's that once a person has internalized a norm, they become intrinsically motivated to comply with it. Again, that doesn't mean that they always behave in accord with it. Human behavior is driven by a whole host of motivations. You know, it's not just one thing, one motivation which complies with behavior. They may be more motivated to do something else, but at least intrinsically motivated to comply with the norm. And then if they see someone else to whom the norm applies, who is transgressing it, they're also intrinsically motivated to enforce it. And I'll say a little bit more about what we have in mind by enforcement in a second here. But first, just to cash out the connection between internalized norms and the motivational profile we see there. A lot of the motivational oomph for internalized norms look like it comes from specific emotions or just has a kind of affective coloring to it one way or another. And there's lots of different work on the way emotions and affect connects up to norms here. But when social interactions are running smoothly, emotion or affect, again, provides the intrinsic motivation in a lot of cases for a person to comply with those internalized norms. And these emotions or this affective valence can be positive. So maybe you get the feeling of doing something right when you comply with a norm, or maybe there's kind of avoidant or the feeling that keeps you from doing something which the norm forbids, together with, and this isn't a specific emotion, but just kind of a affective vibes feeling. When you're in kind of social flow, when you can move through your social world with a kind of competence and a kind of fluency, that has the fluency there has a nice presents itself with a nice feeling that a lot of people commented upon. So that's when social interactions are running smoothly. When social interactions are disrupted in one way or another, so the emotional injection into the system is often something unpleasant. So it can produce the intrinsic motivation to enforce an internalized rule if you see someone else has violated it. So when you see someone else sort of cuts the cue, you might feel a quick flash of anger, or you hear about someone who's just callously embezzled money from other people, and you might feel a kind of moral disgust or revulsion towards them. And those sorts of negative feelings when norms are violated can be self-imposed as well. So a person may violate a norm that they've internalized, and then afterwards they may feel guilt or shame of some sort, depending on the norm and maybe depending on what kind of culture they come from. We have the concrete example of Jordan. Now we're going to take another concrete example to get it on the table to sort of do a compare and contrast. So consider Alice here. So Alice is an intrepid traveler. She's excited to go see the world. Let's say she's visiting a foreign country for the first time, and she's sort of relishing the experience of being new and sort of seeing all the small and even some of the bigger ways that they do things differently in this country that she's gone to visit. This kind of fish out of water feeling can be very exciting. That's part of why Alice selected into this travel adventure. But parts of it can be kind of unpleasantly fraught as well. So the unfamiliarity, which is part of the allure of these sort of adventures, can also be, it can be jarring, and it can certainly be exhausting in a way that just moving through your home social world isn't exhausting. On our view, an important source of this is that the stranger in the strange land, as it were, have a norm psychology which has internalized a set of norms, a huge set of norms from their home culture. And then when they go somewhere else, when Alice visits the foreign land, the norms she has internalized and that she's sort of alert to and complies with easily and fluently are out of sync with the norms in the foreign land. She becomes misaligned. There becomes a mismatch between what she's carrying around in her head, as it were, and the new social context that she's put herself in. So as these disruptions, as this out of syncness, or these sort of mismatches between other people's social expectations and her impulses pile up, Alice experiences more and more unpleasantness. There can be kind of a cumulative feeling as she feels sort of disfluent and clumsiness. So some days it can be sort of invigorating, and other days she can just feel kind of beaten down by it. Oops. So call this experience affective friction, the result of these mismatches, again, between an individual on the one hand and their norm psychology and their set of internalized norms, and then on the other hand, the social context that they're in. So if you have someone who is in one of these mismatched situations, the intuitions that their norm psychology generates, sort of the social expectations which have been used to attune their different emotional responses, about how to easily move through their social environment, are sort of consistently wrong-footing them. They're led astray in maybe some small ways, and again, in maybe some larger ways. So the behavior kind of falls out of sync, and it fails to smoothly coordinate in the way that maybe she's used to when Alice back home, as she keeps trying to interact with people in this other country. And she's just sort of knocked out of the usual easy, pleasant vibe associated social flow, or the kind of autopilot that she's used to. And she's forced that, she's sort of thrown back instead to devote costly, explicit attentional and cognitive resources to think about everything. Look right instead of left before I cross the road, or what, how do I order at this restaurant? She has to consciously go through this about what she ought to do to not cause further disruption. And so we can spell this out and name a little bit more of the different components of the cocktail of affective friction here. From the most basic, so Jordan Throws has this nice paper on our sense of should, which takes a predictive processing model and tries to extend it into social interactions. And at the heart of that is just this idea that unanticipated novelty, again, including unexpected changes to our social worlds, can also sort of the default response to them affectively as a kind of unpleasant experience. Charlie Kurth has done a lot of work lately. He wrote a book in 2018 looking at the feeling of anxiety and the way that is often generated by uncertainty, and he even pulls out a particular kind of anxiety that he thinks is generated by normative ambiguity. So if you have to constantly be thinking about what the right norm norm is to follow. He thinks it performs an important role, but the experience of it is, as we all know, I'm guessing, fairly unpleasant. Alexandra Plakius has a super fun book coming out, or it might be out already, on awkwardness, where she diagnoses the feeling of awkwardness as being a kind of mismatch and a kind of uncertainty about what the right social scripts are and what the right social norms are to follow in any particular situation. Looks like that's going to be another element of what we're calling affective friction. And then these can be just generated, but another element of the unpleasantness associated with this kind of thing is that when you violate norms, the unpleasantness doesn't just come from you and your recognition that you've done something wrong. Like oftentimes other people yell at you in one way or another. So if if Alice is in a foreign world, she's experiencing and sort of engaged in a kind of social clumsiness. That's not just going to be unpleasant for her, but she's disrupting other people's social interactions as well. And so they're likely to express annoyance at her. If she violates an important norm, it may ramp up from mere annoyance or irritation to something like genuine moral anger or disgust or contempt. So returning to Jordan's affective friction. So now we got Jordan and Alice on the table. He's not a stranger in a foreign country, of course, but we think that his annoyance and his eye rolls deserve a similar diagnosis. They're kind of sourced in the same way. But what's happening to Jordan is that common ways of doing things and sort of the old norms of what he considers his home turf, his home environment, these norms that he's already internalized, maybe that he's been using for decades and that have worked from his point of view just fine so far, they're being challenged. And maybe some of the old norms are being actually pushed out and replaced by new ones. And his eye rolls are symptoms, sort of expressions of the unpleasantness he feels in the face of this. It doesn't happen all at once to him, like it's happened to Alice, or like it happens to an immigrant that's not going somewhere else for an adventure, but is, moves to a foreign land for some other reason. With Jordan, it's happening slowly. There's a slight but growing mismatch between, on the one hand, his norm psychology and his internalized norms, and on the other hand, again, what he considers his home turf, his own social context. But that social context is changing. It's in flux. So his affective friction can include a lot of the different pleasant elements that I mentioned so far. And again, they can have a kind of slow building, cascading feeling as well. It doesn't happen all at once, but it can be cumulative. So the default response to, again, unpleasant response to novelty and social norms, the most basic, just sort of unpleasantness to any new norms. Then he might also have sort of a growing sense of clumsiness together with an embarrassment, a loss of social fluency that he sees happening a little bit more and more every year. He hasn't internalized the new norms, and these new norms that he's being asked to comply with are actually incompatible with the norms that he has internalized. He might sort of have rising anxiety about, he doesn't quite know what the new lay of the land is, so he doesn't quite know even when he's violating one of the new norms that the kids these days are trying to impose on him from his point of view. Maybe he feels a kind of awkwardness or a kind of self-imposed shame or guilt when he actually does violate the new norm. And it could be the case that he's experienced, at least in the past, a kind of anger or contempt of others when he violates the new norms and they try and enforce them. So just way station here, and maybe the central point of the talk is that the story we've told, if you buy it, you can tell the story without saying anything evaluative about the norms that it mentions, whether or not those norms are just or fair, or whether or not the norms from the foreign country or the home country, which ones are better, or whether or not the new norms which are coming on board in Jordan's face are in fact improvements, or whether or not they're degradations. Is this an instance of moral progress, or would this be an instance of moral regress, right? The psychological account we've given so far is just completely evaluatively neutral with respect to the justificatory status of the norms in question. So just to say a little bit more about this, because this will be, to the extent we have anything ameliorative to say here, this will be part of it. again, affective friction, its home is within the individual person, but social norms are inevitably connected to social interactions. And so part of social norms, I mentioned before, even the motivational signature of an internalized norm involves the fact that you care not just about your own conduct, but about other people's. So an additional source of affective friction derives from these sort of interactive characteristics of social norms. An important feature of the norms is that they are what, and again, this is a piece of terminology from Evan and Kristen's paper, which is very useful. They're socially maintained. And so there's a sense in which socially maintained is just another way to talk about the enforcement of norms, but it's shorn a little bit of the purely negative connotations which have built up around the terminology of enforcement or punishment. So a norm is socially maintained when conformity to it, or conformity to the norm, the behavioral regularity, is incentivized by the responses of the members of the community itself. So on this view, social maintenance can be of the positive sort, or it can be of the negative sort. So again, the most common, commonly discussed anyway, forms of social maintenance are often negative. So one way to punish or maintain a social norm is those who violate it become the subject of criticism. They take reputational hits if they violate the norm, especially too often. Social gossip is a good way for a community to let everyone else know whether or not people are complying with or in violation of norms. When it gets especially pronounced or dramatic, punishment can turn into social exclusion, and then full-on material or even physical forms of punishment as well. But then there's other ways to maintain social norms which are positive, and that would be the incentives are carrots rather than sticks, the metaphor way of talking about it. So you praise people for complying with a norm, maybe particularly a new norm, which you're trying to get installed into a community. You appeal to social inclusion, you provide gains of status, or a group can collectively do this stuff as well. And the sense of social belonging, which comes from accepting a new norm that certain members of a community are trying to spread, is certainly a form of positive maintenance as well. So the kinds of social maintenance processes that incentivize conformity to the new norm, again, when you think about it in conjunction with this idea or this phenomena of affective friction that we're developing, is when a norm is primarily enforced via negative social maintenance strategies, that's going to add to an already sort of negatively valenced kind of emotional experience. So someone already feels disfluent, maybe a little bit awkward if they don't quite know what the norms are, or if they're having trouble adjusting their behavior to comply with them. Enforcing that with negative social maintenance is going to just ramp up the unpleasantness of the experience itself. But if social maintenance factors, which are positive, can be brought to bear, that might be a mitigating effect. It might be a way to sort of overcome the sort of friction that at the social level, that affective friction at the level of the individual might contribute to. So other factors which are gonna be in play here when you're thinking about when we're thinking about affective friction and social change, are going to come from other nearby elements of our social psychology. So an important one here is going to be social identity. It's going to be a driver, at least a contributor to social friction in a lot of ways. So if there's new norms coming into play or spreading or being considered for uptake, different members of a community, one of the key lenses through which that consideration is going to be done is an agent's social identity. So new norms are often perceived as either reifying a social identity, like being easily compatible with it, and if they are, they're going to be easier, or it's going to be more natural to adopt those, in spite of the fact that we think there's always going to be a little bit of affective friction in having to adopt a new norm. There's always going to be some sort of emotional cost to doing that. If the norm can be seen as contributing to or building or strengthening a social identity, that's going to mitigate the cost, maybe offset it. So you look at a lot of campaigns which are sort of strategically savvy about the behavioral changes that they're trying to induce. A lot of times they'll do this very, very explicitly. So World War II rationing propaganda really hammered that you can install you can give uptake to these new norms having to do with rationing. thinking about it as you're contributing to the cause, you're being a good, and the case that we're thinking about here, a good American. I saw this in real time during COVID, where my university, Purdue, which is in the middle of a very Republican, conservative, red state, and so there was a lot of politicization of masking and social distancing norms, and what Purdue did was explicitly appeal to the identity not of an Indiana, not of as an American, but as a Boilermaker, as a member of the Purdue community, to try and get people to take these norms on board, and like by and large it was fairly successful. But one of the potential hurdles here is that there's the possibility of backlash. So negative social maintenance, of course, thinking back to Jordan, can lead to resentment, and it can sort of sow the seeds of this backlash, especially in situations where we're in a polarized world right now, where a new norm isn't really spreading uniformly throughout a community. It's a little bit more patchy. So oftentimes, sort of those who are trying to act as advocates or entrepreneurs for a new norm, the early adopters of a new norm, on the one hand, and those who are resisting it, or the possible late adopters on the other hand, the normative laggards, way to think about it, those often these days fall along familiar social divisions, where there's already sort of identities entrenched, and that can again add to more layers of this experience of affective friction. So in the case of Jordan, we can see this happening. Members of an older generation, oftentimes these again splits with the olds and the youngs, the older generation sort of runs afoul of some new norm which is being championed by the youth, and then that leads the members of the younger generation to engage in social maintenance to sort of correct their norm violating, or what they see as their norm violating elders, can even lead to mocking with the now well-known okay boomer meme. But this can have, again, sort of a backlash effect. This can have an ironic effect where the older folks can see this as, look, this is my home culture. This is where I've been just fine for decades. There's this sort of new insurgent group, which can look like, or at least look like from the point of view of our identity psychology, as a hostile outgroup. And it can lead, members of the older community to sort of commiserate, seek support from others in their own group, solidify their bonds in the face of what they see as a perceived opposition. And that can lead to this effect where breaking the norm that they don't like, that they feel is being sort of unjustly or illegitimately imposed on them, and maybe even breaking it sort of loudly and proudly, that can begin to take on a signaling function, what evolutionary anthropologists call it start acting like an ethnic marker, a rallying cry, or sort of a public affirmation of this shared group identity. And when that happens, those the attempts to spread the new norm, especially if they're not done with a sort of sensitivity to this kind of dynamic, are just going to fail. So what they're trying to do, the proponents of the new norm, when they respond too negatively, they fail to correct anything. And what they end up doing is actually further entrenching the very behavior that they were attempting to discourage. So it's sort of straightforwardly counterproductive. So we have affective friction. The way that Evan and I are trying to build up this idea is it's primarily something which is experienced by an individual person. So take Jordan or take Alice. At its heart, it's the unpleasant feelings that are generated by, on the one hand, a mismatch between a person's norm psychology and then their social context on the other. But those unpleasant feelings, again, if it becomes the case that there's enough individuals in a society that are experiencing this kind of affective friction, then it's gonna generate collective level effects, which are going to serve as kind of maybe the least bad outcome. It's going to be a kind of brake on societal change. It's going to be a kind of friction which acts there. But at its worst, it can have this really dramatic polarizing effect. Right. So the effects here, as we've tried to point out, and this is one of the things that we really want to try and explore when we continue developing this idea is think about the dynamics that are going to happen when it comes to these sorts of feedback loops between individual and collective levels, especially with respect to norms and norm change, with respect to identities, with respect to entrenched scripts and narratives, which also have these sorts of individual and social level composite or cluster of properties. And I've been doing work with some other collaborators on exactly this issue of how to think about the more systematically about the interactions between social structures and individual agencies, and how we can build more bridges between those two, so we can develop interventions which are sensitive to the constraints and the possibilities for nudging at both levels. Okay, so epistemic upshot of the story we've told right now, sort of at its most basic level, is that if we're right about this, if our diagnosis is on the right track, then we have good reason to mistrust the eye roll heuristic. So it's maybe easy to think of, the entrepreneurs of some new norm, or oftentimes maybe they come off to us as, if we're the ones whose behavior is being asked to change, as maybe they're self-righteous or preachy or otherwise off-putting. But that fact that they strike us that way tells us nothing about the norm that they are advocating for, whether or not it's an improvement, whether or not it's a moral, an instance of moral regress, or moral backslide or whatever. The negative experience, the experience of affective friction itself, is unpleasant, has like a negative valence. But the fact that it's caused by the new norm isn't evidence that the norm itself is bad or that we shouldn't accept it. So again, it might be easy to think that irritation in these cases, or the annoyance that you feel is sort of your bullshit detector going off, or your moral compass sounding the alarm that something untoward is happening, or that this is an example of things going wrong. But on our view, that would be to misread your own emotions, that your annoyance is just a feature of your norm psychology becoming misaligned and reacting to the unfamiliar. And there's a story about why you experience a negative or unpleasant emotion there, but it's not a response to the moral properties of the norm itself. So again, another way to put this, the upshot on it here, moral progress should feel annoying. We should expect moral progress to feel annoying, even when it's genuine moral progress. The annoyance is a symptom or a basic product of the affective processes that are integrated with our norm psychology, which drive norm-guided activity, are going to make us naturally averse to norm change. The very things which allow us to be so fluent in cases where we're synced up with our social context are going to be the same process which kind of sound the affective alarm when we become unsynced from it, or mismatched to it. And a better response, we think, would be to treat irritation here as a cue for further reflection, rather than just take it at face value as an indication that something is going wrong, and sort of take those feelings under advisement, consider them along with a number of other relevant factors. Is this new thing, or this new behavior I'm being asked to take up, is that actually bad, or does it just feel kind of awkward and unpleasant because it's unfamiliar? All right, 2 objections, maybe 3. The last one's just a way to end the talk. But first one I think is an important one, and it's the idea that positionality matters here. So maybe the story we've told about affective friction isn't really going to be a one-size-fits-all story, and that different people's affective friction is going to be it's going to be indicative of different kinds of social change, depending on whether or not they're beneficiaries of the status quo. So someone like Jordan, we picked him obviously with malice aforethought, has a sort of position of privilege and social power. He's a professor, he's tenured, changes to the status quo, not all, but most changes to the status quo are going to be experienced by him not just as uncomfortable. We think any changes to the status quo are going to be experienced by everyone as uncomfortable. But they're gonna oftentimes genuinely sort of come at his expense. If he's had a kind of unearned privilege in the way things have been, and the things are changing, it's even if they're getting more fair, that may come to some personal expense at him, and it may feel like to him that this is a form of oppression. He's feeling all kinds of bad things in the face of this. The loss of unearned privilege can feel like oppression. We kind of know this. So will the same thing here be true of those and to benefit from positive norm change. Society is being made more fair, or harm is being reduced, and those who directly benefit from that, is the same thing going to be applied to them, or do we need a different story to be told there? If we accept the basic premise of standpoint epistemology, then the members of oppressed groups are actually going to be in a better position to recognize conditions of oppression and injustice, maybe recognize which norms are the most unjust or which ones are the most oppressive. And so maybe in this sort of, given their sort of social position, the eye roll heuristic for them isn't going to be untrustworthy. Maybe we should actually put a lot of stock into that and listen to their complaints. So an example of this, to make it a little less abstract, Céline Leboeuf describes a particularly insidious form of social friction, which she calls bodily alienation. This is drawing on and sort of developing some ideas in Dubois about double consciousness. And what she describes is that at least in the United States, constantly having to navigate white spaces, which is most of the US, can lead non-white people to come to see themselves through the eyes of their oppressors. And just sort of the persistence of this accumulates until it creates feelings of awkwardness, and that awkwardness kind of disrupts social fluency. Again, it's a kind of bodily alienation, which makes it hard for racialized individuals to be at home in and smoothly navigate their social environments. And some of the interesting work here is the way that it connects to another kind of affectively negatively valenced emotion, which is anger. Appreciation of this, or sort of being subject to it for such a long time, can generate feelings of anger. One response to it, Leboeuf suggests, is to draw on that very emotion. So anger of this sort should be embraced, she argues, trusted, because it can spark people to action, and it can inspire racialized individuals to reject oppressive norms and to motivate people to pursue social justice. So our reply to this is that just to sort of accept the account there, experiences of bodily alienation that drive this kind of anger on the one hand, and feelings of affective friction, this sort of term of art which we're trying to develop on the other hand, we think stem from different sources. So the body alienation that Leboeuf describes is a response to relatively stable features of one's home culture. So the social disfluency that she's sort of pointing to, at least the sources of the social disfluency there, which is similar, we're also talking about social disfluency, that she highlights, is caused by racial individuals just having to sort of persistently and constantly confront a feature of their environment, which itself is fairly constant. It's stable. It's this racism which is woven into the very fabric of their society, into the structures and laws themselves. Affective friction, on the other hand, for us, arises, at least in these cases that we're pointing to, when there's a misalignment between an individual's norm psychology on the one hand and whatever norms prevail in their social environment, and their ability to sort of move through those. Again, whether or not the norms are just or unjust, whether or not they're fair or unfair. And in the cases of social change, it's the instability that we're interested in, that we're trying to point to here, that there's change happening in the environment, and the affective friction is just a response to that. It's the growing lack of being in sync, not of being in sync, but the norms themselves being oppressive. So we think these two kinds of emotional experiences are distinct. The experiences described by Leboeuf, again, are probably unique to racialized individuals, certainly, but the affective friction, we think, is likely, even if it comes from different sources, that kind of thing is likely to be universal. All right, second objection, idea that, well, look, maybe affective friction, it's not a bug here, it's a feature, and it's a feature in a particular way, or the art that it's a feature should move us to have a default kind of trust into the negative reaction we have to new norms. So again, this is a very different kind of criticism. There's different ways to spell out arguments for it, which I don't have time to get into, but we can talk about them. But the idea here is that, look, we have this piece of our minds, this norm psychology, and what affective friction is doing in the case of its responding to norms which it's not expecting is acting as something like a normative immune system. So what it's doing is protecting us from getting infected by bad norms, whatever the cluster of norms which we have, which has been bequeathed to us from the past in our culture. They've been vetted by years and years and years of cultural evolution, maybe, or maybe there's a kind of functionality and wisdom which is baked into our institutions and our norms, which we don't understand as individuals, but we should have a kind of default trust towards, would be the politically conservative way to make this argument. And so our norm system, when it's responding to new candidate norms, it's protecting us from all the other bad kinds of norms which have already been maybe siphoned out by these other collective processes. So the system has a familiar kind of better safe than sorry logic built into it. It errs on the side of safety, but the price we pay for the safety is that sure, it ends up rejecting a few harmless or even positive norms, but that's the price we pay for the bad norms that it sort of protects us against taking on. And there's way more of those than there are beneficial ones. So the line of thought would go. And our reply here is that, look, the criticism does get something right. In practice, affective friction sometimes prevents us from adopting harmful norms. Just we want to grant that. But we also want to say that when we're focused on norm psychology, it would take an extra argument that we are skeptical of to think that that's what affective friction is for, or that our norm psychology does something like only internalize norms that are good for society. On the view that we have, and again, there's an argument for this in the background, what our norm psychology, what its function is to keep us in sync with our social environments. It doesn't really care what the norms it processes, whether or not they're morally good or bad. What this one intuitive piece of our minds is designed to do is just help us move fluently through, again, whatever social environment we're used to, using whatever norms we've internalized. So this piece of our mind and whatever it produces in response to changes or norms it doesn't expect, it doesn't care about those norms. But again, taking a step back, we as full people and as collective societies, we do care. Our minds can contain much more than just these little generators of emotional response and these norm psychologies themselves. And as full people, we can make all things considered judgments. We can evaluate moral arguments. We can think about reasons when we decide what to do or which norms we should accept, which ones are worth advocating for, and which ones are worth rejecting. And as we sort through all these possibilities, we think we shouldn't place too much trust in a psychological system who, if we're right, the default response to any norm change is to, at least if it's either to produce unpleasant experiences in response to it, and if that's treating it as it's bad, then treating it as it's bad. All right, so practical upshot. What can we do with all this? Are there sort of conclusions to be drawn about how to do social change better or help sort of nudge societal change in the direction of moral progress? We don't have any magic bullets here. We don't think that there is going to be any single magic bullet. This is part of an enormously complicated story. But some of the upshots are that understanding the cognitive science of norms is going to help us understand norm change better and maybe how to direct and steer norm change in the ways that we want it to. And understanding norm psychology and what affective friction is and what it does should push us to sort of think more carefully about the affective, how we mobilize emotions and think about the affective valence of the new behavior and how we're trying to induce it. So maybe think back to someone like Alice, who doesn't experience the changes as purely or even first and foremost unpleasant. She's driven by curiosity. There's sort of a suite of emotions like curiosity or a sense of adventureness that allows us to embrace novelty or to explore the world in pursuit of new things. And those, if we're trying to judge norms or trying to, again, push society and steer social change in particular directions, those maybe deserve a more prominent place in the toolkit. So explore and travel and have adventures and see different ways of doing things. And if you can't do that, do the sort of agential and imaginative yoga that you can do from your own home, like read novels and play video games and stuff like that. And certainly employ positive forms of social maintenance that reward conformity rather than punish nonconformity. I mentioned before, Purdue did a surprisingly good job of invoking shared identities and pushing people to be good Boilermakers when they were trying to get everyone to mask up and engage in social distancing. And I think that's exactly the right way to go here, instead of building a sense of threat and conflict, and maybe use pedagogical approaches to normative instruction, which do a similar kind of thing. Again, they're very early days here or whatever. This is a menu of options to explore. We don't think that's anything definitive. And then just quickly, objection 3. wouldn't this approach to norm change sort of create a big burden, especially that first objection having to do with positionality, create a big burden for those people who need new norms in order to experience a more just society or just kind of live their lives in peace? And one objection may be, look, it's not their job to educate the who are already better off, who has the time, like it's not, who has the patience. Is it really Jordan's student's job to tell him how to behave? Again, this is a sketch of a solution for how to solve a problem like Jordan, maybe go with positivity and curiosity and exploration. But it's a challenge, maybe that's not going to work, but it's a challenge that needs to be taken seriously because there's a lot of Jordans out there in the world and they occupy a lot of positions of power and they're going to be a source of friction on social change. So we just know that the approach that we're offering here isn't going to be perfect. It's, you know, it may even be the fact that we have to educate the Jordans of the world downright annoying. But, you know, that's our message anyway. Moral progress is going to be annoying. So there it is.